Into the mud. The sun had not risen for 3 days, not because it wasn't there, but because the sky above the western front had become a permanent curtain of smoke, ash, and drifting artillery dust. Private Thomas Calder pressed his back against the trench wall, feeling the wet mud ooze through the fabric of his uniform. The cold cut through him like a knife. Everything along the front line smelled of rotting sandbags, rotting earth, rotting bodies. He had been in France for 6 weeks, but it felt like 6 years. Time did not move normally here. The trench was a world of its own, sealed off from the world he once knew, a world where life and death existed side by side in the same narrow space. Thomas had been a farmer before the war, waking to the sound of birds, the slow rise of the morning sun. Now he woke to shells screaming in the sky and the ground shaking beneath him as if the earth itself were trying to flee the madness. When he first arrived, he thought the trench was simply a long ditch carved into the earth. But he soon learned it was a labyrinth, a maze of firing bays, dugouts, communication lines, and narrow pathways barely wide enough for 2 men. At night, rats as big as kittens crawled across the soldiers' boots, feeding on scraps and sometimes on the dead. Some soldiers joked about the rats being the true rulers of the Western Front. Others simply accepted them, because in the trench you learned very quickly what could be ignored and what couldn't. On Thomas's second day in the trench, he met Corporal Matthew Briggs, a veteran of 2 years, an eternity in trench time. Briggs had the look of someone who had seen the world end multiple times and somehow come back alive. First rule, Briggs said, tossing Thomas a damp piece of bread, never stand taller than the sandbags. A sniper can kill you before you even hear the shot. Thomas nodded, his hands trembling. He had heard the rumors, sharpshooters waiting silently, scanning the parapets for a momentary shadow, a helmet edge, a naive head rising a little too high. Second rule, Briggs continued, never get attached to mornings. They are the quietest because both sides are too cold to start killing each other. It won't last. The third rule was one Thomas learned himself, never look directly at a man who has just died. The sight had a way of crawling into your dreams. By the 3rd week, he could no longer remember the last time he had slept without waking in panic. The trench constantly hummed with tension, artillery in the distance, nervous muttering, the occasional scream, and the never-ending sounds of shovels repairing collapsed walls. Soldiers were always working, always reinforcing, always trying to survive the elements as much as the enemy. Rain turned the ground into quicksand, swallowing boots and sometimes whole bodies. Frostbite turned toes black, lice burrowed into seams of uniforms and never left. The trench, in its cruelest form, became a living monster, one that clawed at its inhabitants bit by bit. One night, around 2 a.m., Thomas sat with Briggs near a flickering candle in a dugout carved into the trench wall. Outside, a cold drizzle fell, creating a symphony of dripping water mixed with distant explosions. Tell me, Thomas whispered, does anyone ever get used to it? Briggs rubbed his hands together, warming them near the tiny flame. You don't get used to it. You learn to pretend you're used to it. That's the only way men stay sane long enough to survive. A sudden whistle pierced the night, the sound every soldier feared. The air tensed. The dugout walls shook. Then came the explosion, so powerful the candle blew out instantly. Dirt rained down from the ceiling. Thomas pressed himself flat against the floor, heart pounding in his throat. Briggs shouted, gas! Get your masks! Greenish smoke began rolling along the ground like a living creature, slithering into every crack. Thomas's hands fumbled with the straps of his mask. His lungs burned with panic as he forced the mask over his face. Men screamed in the distance, those who had been too slow or too far from their equipment. The gas lingered for minutes that felt like years. When it finally began to dissolve, a suffocating silence fell over the trench. Men emerged cautiously, their masks still on. A few figures lay motionless near the fire step. One soldier, face blistered and eyes swollen shut, coughed violently as medics dragged him away. Thomas stared at the bodies. Something inside him hardened. The next morning brought no sunshine, but it brought orders. The battalion would be rotated to the frontmost firing trench by evening. Thomas felt a cold dread seep into him. Frontline duty meant direct exposure to enemy fire. It meant staring across no man's land, waiting for the next assault, knowing death could arrive from anywhere, from a sniper, a mortar, a hidden machine gun. As evening fell, the company moved silently through the narrow trench corridors. The sun dipped behind the clouds, leaving the world in shades of gray and shadow. Thomas reached the parapet and peeked across no man's land. The landscape was a nightmare, twisted trees, scorched earth, broken helmets, skeletal remains. Brake stood beside him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Welcome to the edge of the world," he muttered. And for the first time, Thomas believed it.